Hi everyone, my name is Kimberly Koerth and I'm a senior in the Women and Gender Studies program here at Arizona State University. I'm going to be talking to you today about Tobin Siebers' work on the desiring body, particularly the task of defining, describing, and creating a sexual culture for disabled people, which is the title of a chapter in his 2008 book, Disability Theory. The thing about disabled bodies is that they are constantly seen as not legitimate or not complete. Bodies can be born disabled or they can become disabled, but in either circumstance they are in a permanent state of being wrong. In referencing my first video on Sarah Ahmed's theories about disgust, these bodies are assigned a permanent context of badness that ignores their present circumstances or any speech utterances by the people in possession of those bodies. Having a disabled body also takes away a person's voice, figuratively speaking, and their agency over themselves, their bodies, and their decisions. We see disabled bodies as asexual, as either non-desirous or incapable of desire, or even not deserving of being desirous. The context of disabled bodies as disabled overrides their potential for any form of sexuality. Siebers writes, quote, "Disabled people have long struggled to take control of their bodies from medical authority." End quote. He continues, quote, "Disabled people experience sexual repression, possess little or no sexual autonomy, and tolerate institutional and legal restrictions on their intimate conduct. Moreover, legal and institutional forces inhibit their ability to express their sexuality freely and to develop consensual relationships with sexual partners." End quote. Because able-bodied people think having a disability equals the end of the world, they often don't even begin to consider what life might be like outside of that disability, or that life could exist even with it. The truth is that many disabled people experience sexual desire and act on those desires, just like able-bodied people do. Disabled people are capable of consenting to sexual activity, and they're capable of engaging in sexual activity, regardless of any physical or verbal limitations they might face. Many in the disability rights community like to emphasize their creativity, a statement that is often accompanied by a wink. Although able-bodied people like to deny disabled people and disabled bodies their agency, many seek to reclaim this power by expressing their desires radically and loudly. Siebers notes that not many people with disabilities consider themselves to be a sexual minority. This is true. Some disabled people identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. Some might have unique or non-normative interests, but many are heterosexual and cisgender. Many desire monogamy and marriage and children. And regardless of what each disabled person's preferences are, their sexuality is an important part of their lives, even if it is not the most important part. People with disabilities think about sex and often want to have sex, and these thoughts can and do occur alongside thoughts about their disabilities, their abilities, their jobs, their friends, their hobbies, and the rest of their daily lives. Siebers concludes, quote, "Nevertheless, I want to argue that disabled people do constitute a significant sexual minority, and that recognizing their status as sexual citizens will advance the cause of other sexually oppressed groups." End quote. What does Siebers mean by sexual citizens? Sexual citizenship refers to a person's belonging within the realm of sexuality, within the world of desire and practice and behavior. Recognizing disabled people as sexual citizens allows them to be seen as sexual beings, and both sexual subjects and sexual objects. It empowers them to act on their sexuality in ways that are viewed by the rest of the society as legitimate and even relatable or similar. Disabled people don't just have sex with other disabled people, much like they don't just interact with other disabled people. There is value to possessing a community of disabled people, but it's reductive to deny that disabled people don't also exist within the able-bodied world. Siebers contrasts his use of the term sexual culture with others' reliance on the colloquial concept of a sex life. He defines the distinction as being one of respective norms that depend on concepts of exclusivity and inclusivity. Able-bodied society excludes disabled people, so disabled people's sexual culture can exclude able-bodied people, or at least mystify, disturb, and confuse them. Siebers writes, quote, "Sexual culture references the experience of sex itself, pure, impure, and almost never simple." End quote. One assumption that able-bodied people make about sexuality and their own possession of a sex life is that they can partition it off from the rest of our lives. For able-bodied people, sex is an inherently private affair, unless they choose to make it otherwise, and this is a privilege that is often forgotten. Many disabled people do not have the luxury of sexual privacy. Sex with a disabled body requires communication and openness. It is often public in nature, and while this can be limiting, it is also a form of empowerment. Siebers writes, quote, "Sexual culture is designed as a concept to provide a deeper, more sustained idea of how sex and identity interconnect by resisting the partitioning and privatization characteristic of a sex life. It means to liberate sex, allowing it to overflow the boundaries of secured places and to open up greater sexual access for people with disabilities." End quote. One specific concept Siebers discusses in his article is that of the ideology of ability, which he says determines how we think about sex. The able body is seen by society as the baseline of humanness, so lesser ability, or the absence of ability, immediately marks a person as less than human, according to this ideology, Siebers says. This creates a sexual preference for able bodies, regardless of the reality of how these bodies perform in sexual situations or what the person attached to the body is like. Additionally, Siebers writes, quote, "Sex is the action by which most people believe that ability is reproduced, by which humanity supposedly asserts its future, and ability remains the category by which sexual reproduction as such is evaluated. As a result, sex and human ability are both ideologically and inextricably linked." End quote. Ability is also connoted with health, which in turn is extended to include such factors as happiness and quality of life. Disabled people are so often seen as less than able-bodied people that their lack of ability is interpreted as an emotional and life defect as well. Society thinks disabled people aren't capable of true happiness or fulfillment, so why would they make good sexual or romantic partners? Siebers says that in order for people with disabilities to develop a sexual culture, they must obtain access to safe spaces where they can behave sexually, as well as theorize about sexual behavior. Disabled people need to break down the divide between public and private spaces and combat the history of the separation of the two as a form of regulating sexuality. Even spaces that might be perceived as safe are not actually so. For example, disabled people are often unsafe in medical offices, where they may be the subject of experimentation or where doctors will not thoroughly explain their conditions to them. There is a stigma around inquiring at the doctor's office about something as personal and taboo as sex, even though this is objectively the best source of information for disabled people about their sexual abilities and how to express sexuality despite their disabled bodies. Many other factors relating to the public-private divide play a role in defining the limits of disabled people's sexualities as well. There are economic factors to consider, such as access to private spaces. Some disabled people need attendants. Others live in group homes or other similar facilities where privacy is limited or constantly in danger of being disrupted. Even disabilities themselves are always at risk of disrupting sexual behavior. Disabled people, like all people, have a right to autonomy over their bodies, but society is often bent on denying them this right or avoiding trying to understand how it functions. Finally, Siebers talks about the need for disabled people to develop their own erotics that can exist alongside so-called mainstream sexual culture. Much like queer communities have found ways to resist heteronormativity in their lives, and particularly their sexual lives, disabled people need to, and are, resisting ableism in their own sexual cultures. Many disabilities result in an absence or loss of sensation, for example. Disabled people are able to relocate desire and erotic feelings to unconventional areas of the body. Sexual pleasure doesn't have to be found in conventional ways. Siebers writes, quote, "A parallel geography exists between the places on the body marked for sex and the place where bodies have sex. It is as if the separation between the public and private spheres, dictating where we may or may not have sex, also maps the body according to zones where sexual feelings do or do not reside." End quote. Disabled sexuality seeks to change the erotics of the body for everything from location and communication to pacing and forms of pleasure. Alright, that's it for now. Thanks for listening, everyone, and let me know if you have any questions about my video or Siebers' theories on disabled people and sexual culture. I definitely recommend reading Disability Theory as well as the rest of his book. Thanks again.